Good afternoon, John Whitehead.
Good afternoon, George. Good to see you.
Good to see you. So you are a medieval historian extraordinaire, and you came up to Oriel College, Oxford. Which year was it?
I came up in 1993 as a mature postgraduate student, and I've been here ever since. Who knows? I've gone native to some extent in Oxford, yes.
Right, and your life's passion has been Richard Fleming.
Wouldn't he have been my life's passion, but he's the person I came to study here. He was Bishop of Lincoln from 1420 to 1431. Depending how you could actually say he was only Bishop of Lincoln from 1420 to 1424, and again from 1426, but that's probably a bit technical for people. But he came from my home area in Yorkshire, and I've always been interested in the Middle Ages, and when I had the possibility of coming here to do research, he struck me as an appropriate topic, interesting in himself, but also if like a good vehicle from which to explore the whole range of medieval history at that period, of not only English history, English political and church history, and cultural history, but also European history at the time, because he was at the Council of Constance and he twice went aboard as an ambassador on behalf of Henry V.
Why do you find him so enthralling?
He's become more enthralling. When I was applying here, he struck me as interesting, because he was born in just outside Wakefield, very close to where I was born. I subsequently found out that it's possible that we are technically both members of the same school, that my grammar school in Pontefract was merged in the 16th century with a grammar school that was in his home village, which he might have gone to. So we might not exactly be schoolmates, but at least we're both possibly fellow alumni. He's interesting because looking at his life, which is quite short, he dies when he's only about 45, he actually touches on so many aspects of that period. There are so many places I go to. I thought, oh, well, Fleming had a connection here. Either he was incumbent of the church as a young man, or he was here in Oxford. He's the sort of... He also resists the temptation of modern historians to assign, for example, medieval bishops and say, well, this man is, an administrator, this man is a politician, this man is an aristocrat, this man is a scholar. Fleming, he's not an aristocrat, but he's a churchman, he's a theologian, he's a noted preacher. He's obviously very astute in managing his career, but you can't just shove him in one tidy little box and file him away. And I don't think any of the other men of that period were like that. They would always have had different aspects to their careers, which make him a very good way of, say, opening up that world. And I feel there's one other academic, professional academic in Canada who knows more about him, particularly word of his preaching. But I was once introduced by my supervisor as being sort of the world's leading authority on Fleming. Well, I will demur from that and say that I'm one of the two experts in the world about Fleming.
Now, founding Lincoln College, obviously there's it's an educational purpose, but was there any other purpose in establishing the college?
It was designed to train men who could combat heresy, because Fleming was in the Oxford that had a generation earlier had seen the fairly spectacular career of John Wycliffe and the legacy of Wycliffe, but with Lollardy and heresy. And Wycliffe's influence was something that Fleming wanted to root out. As a younger man in Oxford, he had possibly been suspected of having Wycliffeite ideas, which wasn't difficult at that time because Wycliffe was possibly the best known theologian in the university, and he died about a year before Fleming was born, so they didn't actually overlap, as some 19th century historians had thought. And so Lincoln College, one of the specific projects was to combat heresy. But then if you were founding a college in Oxford in the 15th century, into the 16th century, that's what you said. Wolsey says that when he founds Christchurch, or what becomes Christchurch, in the 1520s. He obviously wouldn't think about Lutheranism. But that was often because the universities were foundations by the church, and they were designed to produce young men who would be ordained. And Fleming was particularly interested in preaching and encouraging young men who could go out and preach not perhaps in the parishes, but possibly more to influence the influencers in, say, cathedral cities, in collegiate foundations, and indeed training up the next generation of clergy. So he has in that sense, a quite modern view of education. I mean, he's possibly, dare I say it, an almost Newmanic view of the use of a university to educate and instruct and form the young.
Which comes on to something else. You used to do Catholic tours of Oxford. Can you explain the significance of Oxford in English Catholicism? I mean, post-Reformation Catholicism.
Post-Reformation Catholicism, Oxford has produced the two most important cardinals in post-Reformation English Catholic history. The first of them is from my beloved college Oriel, William Allen, who was the man who, as an exile in the reign of Elizabeth I, established the seminary at Douay and then at Rheims to educate the missionary priests who came and ventured their lives in keeping Catholicism alive in England. And the other college, the product of Oriel, was of course John Henry Newman, who was an undergraduate at Trinity, but who has really made his name as a leading figure in the Oxford movement, and then with his seismic conversion to full Catholicism in 1845, that he was also a product of Oriel. So in that sense, it's important. Oxford in the 16th century produced a lot of the martyr priests. In the early 17th century, when policies relaxed from the government, there was quite a lot of semi-covert Catholicism in Oxford, alongside almost the even less than covert court Catholicism of James I and Charles I's courts. And Oxford always had an Oxfordshire is a county with a strong Catholic presence in the 16th, 17th centuries and so on. It was in the more conservative side of the country. And of the two historic universities, Oxford was more committed to a Catholic position than Cambridge, although Oxford had earlier on been the first one to actually have a proto-Protestant movement with Wycliffe. In the 19th century, the Oxford movement, starting in 1833, sought to restore the Church of England to its roots in the patristic Church of the Fathers. In fact, they were building on something that had been attempted by a nun, rather sort of radically thinking High Church Don at Lincoln College in the 1730s, but he eventually, Mr. Wesley, turned into something rather different, so that Wesleyanism originates as a sort of proto-Oxford movement in the 18th century. In the 19th century, Newman, Keble, Pusey and Froude start this movement, which takes on a life of its own. Many of them, like Newman, of course, make their way into full communion with the Roman Church. Others, like Pusey, stayed and fought heroic battles for that understanding of the Church of England as part of a wider Catholic Church. And as someone who was brought up for many years in that tradition, I still have great respect for them. And that tradition has shaped the Church of England. When Newman died in 1890, when the Catholic Church was much more of a minority than it is now in English public life, I think it was the Times wrote, "The Church of England is what it is today because of John Henry Newman," which is a remarkable statement to make in 1890 about a Catholic cardinal, when the Church of England was still much more confident in numbers and its sense of position as the established church.
Would you like to explicate your own crossing of the Tiber?
That is a complicated story. When I was received in 2005, somebody asked me, how long have you been thinking about this? And I said, well, since 1963, which is true. I had thought about it as a schoolboy. I always had Catholic relatives, so Catholicism was not something that was alien in the way that it is, I think, for many people in England. And I lived in a town that had a long-standing Catholic presence, going back to before the 1829 legislation. I came up with 9 reasons for my final decision to move, which were rooted in large part in not only my own spiritual experience to find that this was what spoke to me, what Catholicism was offering, but also what I was seeing in terms of the history of the church, that this seemed to be the thing. And when I went for reception classes with a very fine priest who sadly died a few years ago, but Father Jerome at the Oratory, I outlined why I want to be received, and he said, well, that's fine. So we had one session talking about the role of the Virgin Mary in the church. Well, as someone who regularly went to Walsingham, that was not a great novelty for me, though I have grown in my Marian devotion since then. And another one about the role of the papacy. Well, as a medieval church historian, I had no problems with the idea of a hierarchical papal monarchy ruling the church. Not very fashionable these days, possibly, but nonetheless. But for me, it was an easy transition. So, joking with other friends who made the same move at the time, it wasn't a case that we had to swim the Tiber. We paddled across, and we got to the other side, and we found some of our friends already sitting there in the deck chairs, and they handed us a towel to dry our feet, and handed us a breviary, and off we went. So, for me, it was an easy transition. It took time. It happened, I say, at the right time for me.
Is it true that there's a law banning Roman Catholics from being Prime Minister?
No.
Yeah.
There isn't a law that prevents somebody being a Prime Minister, except for the fact that I think one of the bits that's not been repealed with the 1829 Act is that it is illegal for a government minister who is a Roman Catholic to advise the monarch on an ecclesiastical appointment. Now, normally, even now, less so than in the past, of course, appointments would be channeled through Downing Street to the monarch. So that might be routed through another minister at the moment, as we are told that Mr. Johnson has rediscovered his Catholic roots. But there isn't a specific prohibition. There was a prohibition until the 1960s, 1970s, on a Roman Catholic being Lord Chancellor, because the Lord Chancellor controls a lot of livings for clergy in the Church of England. But now that basically all episcopal appointments in the Church of England are sorted out by the Church of England and are then more or less rubber stamped by government, there is less of that issue. I think it would have been more difficult up to about a generation ago for somebody to be a Roman Catholic and Prime Minister, unless, as some people said they would do, they would then assign another minister to advise the Crown on appointments or things like that.
Right. Now, another question, I'm sure. It's a fallacy to say that the Catholic Church in the old days ever banned the Bible in language other than Latin.
They didn't in most countries. It was quite common, for example, in medieval Europe, late medieval Europe, to have in France or French-speaking lands a French-speaking Bible. And that was not unknown in this country. In this country, there was a move against it, and this was a consequence of Wycliffe's movement to have English services, English preaching, make the Bible available to people. Because the view of the hierarchy was just putting the Bible into the hands of people when they didn't have any formation, they didn't have any guidance, then you would likely end up with heretical ideas. And so it's the meeting, the council is called by Archbishop Arundel, Archbishop of Canterbury, under Richard II and Henry IV, in Oxford in 1409, that does basically ban the English translation of the Bible. Some years earlier, Arundel had been praising Richard II's first wife, Anne of Bohemia, for the fact that she did read the Bible in French, because presumably she had chaplains to assist her and advise her. What concerned Arundel was people, and this raised a whole question about the extent of medieval literacy, which I think we often underestimate, of people reading the Bible untutored, or indeed with, say, somebody who was a local hedge preacher who was coming along and saying, oh no, it doesn't mean that, doesn't mean what the church said, it means this, and my opinion is better than the church. So in that sense, the English Bible was banned. But, as I was talking to another friend who's now an Anglican clergyman, in fact, the number of manuscripts of the Wycliffite translation of the Bible that survived from the 15th century is one of the largest numbers of any text to survive from the Middle Ages. And the translation, as far as we can tell, was produced in central Oxford under presumably don't let on what we're doing, in the late 14th century, probably after Wycliffe's death, in fact, but probably in the 1380s, 1390s.
And in the Anglo-Saxon period, wasn't there a Bible in Old English?
There would have been, yes. There certainly is an English Bible at that time. Yes,
yeah.
But that is long beforehand. The Vulgate would be used for liturgical purposes and for academic reference. I'm not an Anglo-Saxon specialist, but I think the importance of the fact that there are Anglo-Saxon translations of the Bible, there are surviving Anglo-Saxon sermons, point again to the sophistication of Anglo-Saxon society. It points to the cultural strengths of Anglo-Saxon England, that is a very sophisticated society, and that you had a well-qualified episcopate, certainly in the 10th century, that great age of Dunstan and so on, that you had a high literacy. And that tradition, I think, survives, and is one of the things that marks out England. It's one of the things that gives England a distinctive culture, not just the fact that we're an island, which must have an effect, but that very rich culture that survives. And even it gets overlaid by, say, French language and so on in the late 11th, 12th centuries, you know that it feeds into that, which comes out later on. So, yes, and there are certainly vernacular Bibles beforehand, but Wycliffe actually does great harm to the case for a vernacular Bible. And maybe Arundel did harm by not saying, well, let's have, if you like, to coin a phrase, an authorised version.
Mm-hmm. Coming back to Oriel, should Cecil Rhodes's likeness be removed from Oriel?
I am not in favour of toppling statues or removing pictures or hiding them and that sort of thing. Cecil Rhodes was controversial in his lifetime. His legacy is a mixed one, but I certainly am not in favour of toppling statues in somewhere like Oxford. Yes, we know that, say, during revolutions, the continent, you've seen statues toppled, or things like the statue of Saddam Hussein being toppled in Baghdad. Those things do happen in literally the heat of the moment, and that makes it a historic event. That's the argument about Edward Colston's statue in Bristol. But no, I think the road should stay up there, because, but long before we had all the recent discussion about this, over 20 years ago, there was some discussion about this when there was a television series about the life of Rhodes. And our then chaplain at Oriel got somebody who had linked to the college, who was a professor writing about Commonwealth and Imperial history, to do an article for the Oriel Record. And the point is that Rhodes, although by modern standards, yes, he is possibly seen as a rather curious figure, very much larger than life, someone who went out there as an invalid for the sake of his health and died as a relatively young man. But his policies in Cape Colony with regard to the black population were much more liberal than those of the Boers in the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. Mm-hmm. And that, in fact, when he was in his late years, when he was creating Rhodesia, and he's the only British colonialist to have a territory named after himself rather than after, say, a member of the royal family, as opposed to cities, but for territories, that he was actually apparently, highly respected by the native population, if one can use that phrase in this day and age without being held up to ridicule myself. I think Rhodes is a much more complex figure than he's made out to be, and he's a product of a society that's very different from ours, but I don't think he should be execrated, and I think certainly, I was tempted to sort of end my emails at that time with sort of SOC, Save Our Cecil, and I'm very glad that the college has decided to do that. It is perfectly reasonable to put somebody in their historical context. That is true of anybody And you and I as historians know that, George, that there are many people who were controversial in the past, who are now either turned into heroes or are so demonised that they can't once be mentioned in fit society. I don't mind putting additional plaques around statues or to put a historical context and saying this, but going around, like the National Trust, fanatically looking at any possible slavery connection. Now they've even decided that Culloden should be linked to this, because the ship that brought Bonnie Prince Charlie to Scotland in 1745 was actually owned by somebody who owned some slaves in the West Indies and traded in that. Better to talk actually about the people who were sent off, the clansmen from Scotland who were shipped out as white slaves to Barbados in 1746. Slavery is not just a black issue. Slavery is one group of people oppressing another. I'm not defending it, but it's a historical fact. And I think you could, and if you say, well, this has an impact on people today, particularly possibly in the United States, fine, get on and deal with the problems that are there now. Don't moan about what happened 200 years ago. If you do that, none of us will go anywhere.
A complete change of topic. Tell me about when you met the Irish president, Erskine Childers.
Well, he wasn't president at the time. This was in 1972, because one of the things that formed my background very much as a local historian in my hometown, Pontefract, that year, in August of 1872, there had been the first parliamentary election by secret ballot in this country. The Secret Ballot Act was introduced that year under the Gladstone government. And the by-election in Pontefract came about because Gladstone had reshuffled his cabinet. And in those days, if a minister changed portfolio, they had to go and fight a by-election in their constituency because they had accepted an office of profit under the Crown. And Hugh Culling Eardley Childers, who was a Liberal MP, one of the two Liberal MPs for Pontefract, had returned, I think, to the Home Office, having been out of office mourning the loss of one of his sons. Can't quite remember the detail of that. And this election was held in August 1872, and it was held by Childers for the Liberals, although there was a significantly large Conservative vote for the amateur sophologists of the 1870s to be almost looking forward to what was going to happen in the general election of 1874. In 1972, my mother, who was then secretary of the local history society in Pontefract, and myself and various other people thought we ought to do something to commemorate this. And in the early 70s, conventional parliamentary democracy didn't have a particularly good image, and we thought this was an important thing to celebrate. And so we got people together, represented the three political parties, and we wanted to represent the candidates. Now, it was easy enough to find the Conservative candidate's successor because he had been the heir to the Earldom of Mexborough, which is actually, and you'll get to this, is an Irish title, although Mexborough is in Yorkshire. So we got the present Earl of Mexborough to come along. And then, well, my mother had to try and find a member of the Childers family. And in those days, you didn't have the internet. So she sat in the public library and went through the telephone directories looking for anybody called Childers. And at the second phone call attempt, she found somebody who said, "Oh, the person you want to speak to is my father-in-law. He's the Deputy Prime Minister of the Irish Republic." So my mother wrote, and thinking, well, he'll send a member of the family, came by return, "Yes, I'm coming." So Mr. Childers turned up with his wife, and it was a somewhat comic occasion because I was deputed to entertain them in the afternoon of the dinner by showing them round Pontefract Castle's ruins. And so there we were walking round, and the castle ruins, there weren't very many people going there on a midweek afternoon at that time. And you suddenly realise, why were these two rather well-dressed young men sitting there reading the local evening paper? They might as well have been holding it upside down in full-dress uniform from the lifeguard, because they were clearly there as security to be sure that nothing happened to Mr. Childers while we were showing him round. But that was when I met him, and we chatted away, and he was a very pleasant, very affable man, and he talked to my mother, and he was and I'm talking to Mrs. Childers about elections in Ireland and this sort of thing, and the life of a politician in Southern Ireland. And in fact, I mean, although the Childers are now associated, of course, because of his father, Erskine Childers, with Irish things and Irish nationalism, the family are actually a Yorkshire family, and they had lived in Doncaster in the 16th century and made a bit of money and went and lived out a country house outside Doncaster. And in the church there's actually a figure of the successful Liberal candidate from 1872 posing as St Hugh of Lincoln. So there is this Victorian statesman with the large beard, but vested as a medieval bishop. It's only St Hugh of Lincoln and so on. So that was my experience of meeting Mr. Childers. And then the following year, when Eamon de Valera stood retired as the second of his terms President of the Irish Republic, he was put forward as the candidate of Fianna Fáil, and so he was led. But sadly, he died, of course, after only about a year in office. But I think he was talking to him, and of course this was a time when the whole Irish situation was very tense between this country and the Republic. I think he could have been, because of his Protestant background, his education at Cambridge, he could have been a figure who could have maybe carried forward the process of reconciliation between traditions in Ireland, might be able to carry it forward more rapidly than has been done. And indeed, I have never visited Ireland, I was in Irish history. I do not know how practicable that process ever is. But that's another topic altogether.
John, thank you so much for your time. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.